You've heard of this man before, Christopher McCandless, the young nomad who inspired Into the Wild. But you probably haven't heard of this man. This is Everett Roos, and he's got some secrets. When searchers went looking through the desert for him, he wasn't there. Instead, they found 2 live donkeys tied to a tree, a campsite left perfectly intact, and a single word carved into a rock nearby. Nemo, Latin for no one. Remember that. Everett's story echoes Christopher McCandless's in so many ways, but where McCandless's story ended in tragedy, Everett's takes a turn that's far darker and far stranger. Everett Roos was born in 1914 in Oakland, California, the second son of Christopher and Stella Roos. His father was a Harvard graduate and a minister, and his mother was a teacher. Now, growing up, Everett's family was highly cultured, and his parents, as well as Everett's older brother Waldo, loved reading Everett bedtime stories that were meant for kids way older than him. And just like Christopher McCandless, Everett became obsessed with books, and his creativity really took off from a young age. Both McCandless and Everett actually read a lot of the same authors and took inspiration from many of the same stories, including a shared favorite, which was Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Pretty much every day, Everett would grab a book, run away from his family's home, and wander off onto a long walk without any adults or any siblings. And on those walks, the young Everett would scribble pages and pages of writing in notebooks and diaries. He was just one of those kids who always seemed like he had a secret, or like he knew some mysterious solution to the universe that was just out of reach, right? And this kind of freaked out his parents, as well as his older brother. The Roos family was pretty conservative, we'll say, not politically, but just like, you know what I'm saying. They had a minister as a father. And so even though they did support Everett's, let's just call it creativity, they did fear, even all the way back then, that one day he might just wander off and then never return. And you know who else's family had those same concerns? That would be the family of Christopher McCandless. This was very similar to McCandless's relationship with his family. They were also more conservative and maybe more practical. And again, they had this young son who was, let's just say, a little different. And I don't want you to take that the wrong way. I can actually appreciate that very much because I'm a little bit different myself. I mean, I have a YouTube channel where I tell weird mysteries to people on the internet, but I don't know. If you appreciate that and you appreciate these videos, consider subscribing to the channel and helping us reach our goal of 1 million subscribers. Thank you very much. So let's flash forward a few years. And at this point, Everett's family was living in Southern California, where he attended high school. And while most 16-year-old boys were out there worrying about school dances, sports, and girls, Everett was instead venturing out into the rugged trails of California's coast, going on long camping weekends pretty much as soon as school let out on Fridays. All he'd bring with him was a bedroll, some food, and of course, his sketching supplies. And much like his childhood, he really liked being alone during these adventures. And so, obviously, Everett wasn't going to be winning the Homecoming King Award anytime soon, though I did find out that he was involved in his high school's literary and civic clubs, and he did actually win an award for a poem he wrote titled Lonesome. Yeah, I could have guessed that one. His family knew by this point that Everett probably wasn't going to college, and any typical career was most likely out the window for him, right? And for some more context, Everett's high school years were right at the start of the Great Depression, which definitely affected his ideas for the future, of course. Now, Everett's father had helped thousands of struggling people who came through his church's doors looking to him for spiritual guidance. And so when Everett decided that he wanted to drop out of high school at 17 years old and head into the deserts of Arizona and New Mexico, all in search of his own spiritual guidance, well, his parents and his brother, though they felt kind of weird about it, certainly couldn't stop him. And so they gave young Everett some supplies, a few bucks, and a long, heartfelt goodbye. Everett walked out the front door of his childhood home with some plans that only he knew about. And maybe, just maybe, he'd make it back home for Christmas. Folks, this is where the legend of Everett Roos really begins. It was spring of 1931, and he was heading east on a horse. But this isn't like full Red Dead Redemption vibes. At this point, There were cars on the road, obviously, and electricity. No Teslas yet, but you get what I'm saying. And apparently at some point, Everett actually ditched his horse and just started hitchhiking. He stuck his thumb out. But other than that, Everett was essentially doing his best impression of being this kind of like vagabond character, right? He was traveling with very few resources. He was working odd jobs, sleeping outside. And again, all of that really reminds me of Christopher McCandless too. Just by the willingness to really live the part, even if he didn't necessarily have to rough it as hard as he did. After a few weeks of travel, Everett arrived in Kayenta, Arizona, and he immediately became entrenched in the Navajo and Hopi communities, learning how to do business with the local tribes by selling his artwork in exchange for food. I mean, picture that for a second. This 17-year-old pasty wannabe vagabond shows up in a town of Native Americans and starts painting stuff. And he doesn't really speak the language that well, and so he's kind of just around. And this, of course, could go one of two ways. Either this random kid could be run out of town, or he could become a straight-up local legend. And folks, that's exactly what happened. Everett's artwork was, by all accounts, very, very impressive, and he actually gained a pretty big following during those first few months. Almost like he was the original influencer or something. I bet if he had a YouTube channel, he'd have even more subscribers than me, unless, once again, you do something about it and hit that subscribe button. Is that bad? Should we cut that? I'll knock it off. Everett was really loving his life at this time. His days were full of meeting people and making art, and every night he would fall asleep under a blanket of desert stars, which sounds really good to me. But there was something on Everett's mind that he just couldn't shake. And that was his home. He missed his family, and of course he knew just how much they missed having him around, right? And we know this, by the way, because Everett's family was constantly sending care packages to local post offices, just kind of guessing where Everett was going to be. And so, in return, Everett often wrote letters back home to his parents. And in these letters, he spoke of the freedom that he was experiencing so far off the grid, the beauty of the landscapes and the people, and the peace that he found while he was out there. I find this really interesting because this was something that both Everett and Christopher McCandless were really drawn to, almost in a hypnotic way, right? With that said, not all of Everett's letters were positive. Let's just say that he kind of had this fascination with the darker sides of life, namely death. He wrote things like, quote, "I must pack my short life full of interesting events and creative activity. Then I shall go on some last wilderness trip to a place I have known and loved. I shall not return." And once again, I need to remind you, he was 17 while talking like this. And I'm sure that if you were his parents or his older brother Waldo, after not seeing him for many months, reading things like that would not have been easy. Like, this is almost giving me emo kid vibes. Like, maybe that's just because that's how I was when I was 17, but maybe Everett was the original influencer and the original emo kid. Okay, that's a stretch. I gotta stop doing this, dude. Despite these concerning letters that he was writing and his concerning attitude, Everett's family really just wanted him to be happy at the end of the day. And so they didn't really dig into things all that deeply. In return for letting Everett live out his dream, his parents just had one simple request for their young son. And that was, please just come home for Christmas. This was a big deal for the Roos family. They were very serious about Christmas. Remember, they're a very Christian family with a father that was a literal minister, right? And Everett, knowing how much his parents cared for him and knowing how much they cared about this holiday, he lived up to that promise. Everett finally returned home a whole 6 months after he left his family behind in the first place. And the family probably thought, you know, maybe Everett got the travel bug out of him and he was ready to kind of think more about his future, maybe consider going to school, maybe find a girlfriend. But no, not for Mr. Lonesome. As soon as Christmas was over, Everett was already planning his next trip. In 1932, now 18-year-old Everett spent 7 more months in the Southwest before returning home for Christmas once again. And in 1933, Everett took to the trails once more, spending 5 months trekking from Los Angeles all the way to the top of California. And at the end of that excursion, Everett's family actually met up with him in San Francisco, for Christmas, of course. By this time, Everett was pursuing his art career a bit more seriously, and he was actually building out a network of some pretty prominent artists for the time, like legendary photographers Dorothy Lange and Ansel Adams, which should tell you a lot, right? I mean, basically everyone who met this kid was charmed by his story, his attitude, and he was starting to get a decent amount of attention from artists across the West Coast. But by April of 1934, Everett, who was kind of jumping between friends in San Francisco and family in Los Angeles, well, Everett had just become totally fed up with the city life, and he longed for his days back in the desert. This time, he was obsessed with the idea of not only the settled communities, but more than that, the vast unknown regions of wilderness in the Southwest. And to narrow it down even more, I'm talking about the giant sweeping deserts of Utah and Arizona. And so, at 20 years old, Everett Roos prepared for his most ambitious journey yet. He was gonna head into a region so remote that even today, few people go there. And folks, I'm talking about the Escalante Canyons of southern Utah, which if you look at a map, is just about as close as you can possibly get to true no man's land. Everett kissed his parents goodbye, and he promised once more that he'd be home for Christmas. And then he set out once again from Los Angeles all the way to the Southwest. And this time, Everett actually brought along two companions, which were two donkeys, I should say, or burros, which is a very poor pronunciation of the Spanish word. That's what Everett used. Burros, I don't know. I'm probably butchering that, but anyways, these burros' names, as chosen by Everett himself, were Chocolatero and Cockleburro, or as I like to call them because they're a little easier to say this way, Choco and Coco. On second thought, on this particular excursion, Everett actually rode the entire way from LA to Arizona. He wasn't a lazy hitchhiker or a nervous teenager anymore, right? He was fully confident in his return to the Southwest, almost like he had some unfinished business there. And when Everett arrived in Arizona, he went right back to Kayenta and he reunited with the Navajo and Hopi communities. And by the way, this wasn't just some quick pit stop. Everett literally took part in a Hopi religious ceremony, and he became fluent in the Navajo language. He also took an odd job with archaeologists from the University of California, and of course, he continued to grind out paintings and poems and journal entries and letters. By this point in time, Everett was pretty much a young philosopher, quoting all of the great thinkers of history in his writings and learning languages like French and Latin in addition to the local Navajo language, which once again sounds very similar to Christopher McCandless. And just to remind you, there was some pretty serious belief in many artistic circles at this point that once Everett returned home, he would have a career in the arts ahead of him, right? Like things were looking very promising for him. But Everett still had one more stop in his itinerary on this trip before he could think about returning home for Christmas. Sometime in early October, Everett made it to Escalante, Utah, which is a tiny dirt road community that's literally out of a Western movie, or at least that's how it felt at the time. It's obviously changed now, but still pretty small. I've only been there once, but anyways, Everett knew that from here, his next travels would be into mostly uninhabited territories of southwestern Utah. And so he took a beat, and he actually spent a few weeks in this small little desert town. According to his writings, he saw a movie called Death Takes a Holiday, which isn't a total surprise considering his interest in the subject matter. And one thing that's a little more wholesome is that he also took on an older brother role to some of the kids in town, teaching them to ride horses and to hunt for arrows. And that all is to say that pretty much anywhere he went, he was starting to be seen as this like folk hero. During these weeks in Escalante, Everett wrote a letter to his parents explaining that he wouldn't be able to communicate for a little while. And this was, of course, very disappointing for Everett's parents. But Everett assured them that he'd still be home for Christmas no matter what. Now, of course, Everett's parents had their doubts, but you have to remember that Everett had never broken this promise, and he had made good on it every single time in the past. And he seemed to actually be in a pretty good place when he was writing this letter. He sounded more mature. He even sent his parents $10 in that letter, along with over 20 of his paintings. Everett's parents would use that money to frame these paintings as they anxiously waited for Christmas time to roll around. On November 12th, 1934, it was time for Everett to leave Escalante. He left wearing a light red shirt that people in the town described as, quote, thin as smoking paper. He had been warned by the people of Escalante about the brutal winters and that in December, snowstorms could even come through the area, which might sound weird for the desert, but that's how it is, as a lot of you know. And yet, despite these warnings, Everett told everyone in town what he had told his parents, which was that he'd be home for Christmas. He told everyone, including his parents, that he was heading into Davis Gulch, which is 45 miles or around 72 kilometers from Escalante. And he chose this area because he had heard a rumor that out there in the gulch, there was this remote Native American cliff dwelling. And so he obviously told the people of Escalante and his parents quite a lot before he left. But there were a few things that he didn't tell anybody. Because of course, as I've hopefully made clear by now, Everett was a very complicated young man. He had different relationships with different people, and he definitely had plenty of secrets. Some of his writings would later reveal that he had gone through some controversial business dealings with Native American tribes, and also that he didn't really like many of the people he came across, despite his popularity among strangers. And then other writings to a close friend named Bill Jacobs revealed his frustrations with the vagabond life and a deep longing for the intellectual people of Los Angeles and San Francisco, as well as some not so subtle hints of his romantic interest in both women and men alike. Knowing that Everett's family was, very religious and conservative, and it also still being the 1930s, this would have definitely been a secret to keep and possibly even something to run away from. But maybe most revealing of all is a letter that Everett wrote to his older brother Waldo during those weeks he spent in Escalante. And this to me is really where I feel like Chris McCandless was literally speaking through him. Everett said that, quote, he would not be revisiting civilization anytime soon. Quote, I'll never stop wandering, and when the time comes to die, I'll find the wildest, loneliest, most desolate spot there is. Which is very concerning just on its face, but notably, this contradicts the promise that Everett had made to his parents that he would be home for Christmas. At this point, Everett's life could have gone in several directions, right? And the truth is that his next move was genuinely a mystery. That is, until November 19th, 1934, a whole week after he left Escalante. According to two sheep herders near Davis Gulch, Everett and his two donkeys rode up next to them. These sheep herders, stunned to see such a young solo traveler, offered Everett and his donkeys some of their mutton to eat, which sounds delicious, right? And yet, despite that, Everett politely declined, and he moved on deeper into the unknown. And I need to make clear here, the unknown that Everett and his donkeys were heading into was no cakewalk, to put it mildly. Danger was everywhere in Davis Gulch. Slick rock stretched for miles. Smooth sandstone that, if Everett slipped, could have sent him tumbling down hundreds of feet. The slot canyons here twisted like veins through the desert, some no wider than Everett's shoulder, like claustrophobic nightmare, right? And always, something I haven't even mentioned yet, was the threat of flash floods. A storm that could literally be miles and miles away could still send a wall of water roaring through a canyon without warning, sweeping away anything and anyone in its path. And plus, there were the human dangers, because you gotta remember, this was still largely an unexplored, unknown frontier with plenty of unaccounted people living on it. Protective Mormon ranchers and rural Navajo people were known to be hostile to anyone who came onto their land uninvited. And plus, the Great Depression had turned many people into outlaws and drifters, outcasts from society who could hide in the canyons looking to rob anyone that they could see, especially a nice-looking, naive 20-year-old with two donkeys. You gotta remember that Everett was chasing this freedom, right? But to me, and feel free to disagree, but I don't know, this sounds more like a death wish and a lot less like freedom. But Everett was young, he was idealistic, maybe he didn't calculate every risk, or maybe he did, and as his writing suggests, maybe he was just ready to embrace whatever came next. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't just ready to embrace the risks, maybe he was actively seeking them out. I don't know. That's just speculation, but weeks and weeks would go by, and Christmas 1934 came and went at the Roos household. They did not get even a single letter from Everett, let alone, have him actually show up and return home for Christmas. Everett had, for the very first time, broken his promise to his parents. And this terrified them, but it didn't necessarily surprise his brother Waldo, especially after the last letter that he had received from Everett. To kind of test the waters, Everett's family would end up sending a Christmas card to the post office in Escalante addressed to their absent son. And a whole month later, a message came back, but it was not what they expected. All that returned was the exact same card that they had mailed to Everett, now labeled return to sender. And so at this point, Everett's family began to panic, right? Because, as we all know, return to sender only meant one thing. And that was, of course, that Everett was unaccounted for. He was missing. And so Everett's father, Christopher, traveled to Escalante and he started asking questions. Eventually, he even pieced together that Everett had gone into Davis Gulch, and so he hired several parties of ranchers, cowboys, and even Navajo guides to go out into Davis Gulch and to look for his son, looking for any sign of life or even just traces of him being there. But every single time they went out, they came back having found nothing. No sign or trace of Everett whatsoever, let alone, actually finding him. And then, finally, after weeks of this, a group of searchers came upon an incredibly disturbing sight in a shaded area of Davis Gulch. They found Everett's 2 donkeys, alive, but they were tied up to a tree with food and water next to them. And nearby, they found Everett's actual campsite. They found his cooking gear, carving tools, painting supplies, art supplies, everything perfectly arranged, almost as though Everett was creating one final portrait of the vagabond life that he was leaving behind. And to finish it off, they found a signature on a nearby rock wall. But the signature didn't have Everett's name, but instead it had his alias. This alias was Nemo. And next to it, he signed the year 1934. And in case you didn't piece this together by now, the only thing they didn't find in this campsite was Everett. Now, at first, some of the townspeople thought that Nemo, Everett's alias, was like a reference to one of his favorite books, which was 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and a character named Captain Nemo, who did go missing in that book. But Everett's father thought differently, because, he knew what no one else in Escalante did. He knew Latin, as did Everett. And so Everett's father knew exactly what Nemo meant. And when you translate it, it means no one, which is a little bit disturbing. I mean, imagine realizing that your son, Everett, or Nemo, I guess, or no one, wasn't just gone, but that he had also basically signed his entire identity away. I mean, that's heartbreaking, because while the world now had a mystery to solve, the Roos family had to come to terms with the total disappearance of their child. And though they struggled to come to terms with this, they didn't give up. Everett's father started broadcasting the search for Everett, and soon the letters that he had written to friends and family became public as people tried to piece together what the hell could have possibly happened. But from the moment that this story hit the press, and through the decades afterwards, Everett's disappearance became even more mysterious and even more twisted. I guess the simplest explanation of what may have happened to Everett is that he had an accident while trekking through the backcountry. I mean, once again, this area is incredibly unforgiving, probably one of the more unforgiving landscapes in all of America. Imagine Everett climbing some slick rock, his donkeys kind of tethered safely down at camp, and then boom, one misstep, he could have tumbled into a narrow crevasse, and then that would have been that. Or maybe he wandered into a slot canyon, and then storm clouds miles away unleashed a bunch of rain, and then a wall of water roars through the canyon without warning, and then that canyon becomes his watery tomb. For many people, this was the most rational theory, that Everett was essentially claimed by the very wilderness that he loved, an accident. And in some ways, this does feel like the most poetic, but others suspected something a bit more sinister. Again, the 1930s in southern Utah were rough years. The Great Depression left many people struggling to survive, willing to do just about anything to improve their lot in life. So is it possible that Everett could have crossed paths with someone who was desperate enough to kill? His supplies, his donkeys, his food, tools, all that stuff, it would have been very valuable. But as you probably realized, there's a massive, massive problem with this theory. And that is, of course, that none of Everett's stuff was taken. Nothing was stolen. The donkeys were left alive. The camp was intact. And so if Everett was murdered, the killers left almost no trace and took nothing. And so that doesn't really make sense to me, but still, at the time, there were whispers, actually, for a long time. In the 1970s, the Navajo tribe, many of whom were alive during the time that Everett was around and disappeared, well, they began to peddle their own theories, suggesting that maybe he was killed by a local businessman or by the remote cave dwellers that he was searching for, and maybe he was buried in a shallow grave. A lot of rumors were floating around, a lot of just theories, but in 2009, these almost wacky theories were actually confirmed. A pile of bones were discovered about 50 miles east from Davis Gulch, around where the cave dwelling that Everett was searching for might have been located. And in an initial round of DNA testing, they basically confirmed that these bones belonged to none other than Everett Roos. National Geographic, the New York Times, among a lot of other publications, ran headlines saying basically, mystery solved, which is crazy. Like, I imagine, this case being closed after like 75 years of mystery. I know this happens every now and again, including in other stories I've covered on the channel, but this almost feels too good to be true, right? And tragically, it was. Apparently, this first batch of DNA testing was completely botched, and all it took was one additional round of DNA testing to show that the bones were not Everett's. And so just like that, this mystery, this legendary mystery that had apparently just been solved, well, it turned right back into the legendary mystery that it is. And around this time, another theory came out from some scholars who had been studying Everett's letters. They tried connecting Everett's obsession with death in all of his letters to the idea that maybe he decided to take his own life out there in the desert. But it's notable that despite Everett's weird obsession with death, he never mentioned actually wanting to take his own life in any of these letters. And also, outside of some, typical complaining, especially for a young man, he wasn't notably depressed or anything. And also, if he did this, why would he have tied up his donkeys and then just left them there? And so now we're getting into some even crazier territory with what could have happened to Everett, which leads me to the next theory. And this is my personal favorite theory. This is, what if Everett didn't die? What if he chose to vanish, just like he had basically promised that he would? What if the Nemo alias and signature he used was not Everett's farewell, but rather a rebirth, essentially? I mean, could he have walked away from his donkeys, his possessions, and even his own name and identity and started a new life elsewhere? Remember when Everett sent $10 and pretty much all of his paintings to his parents? What if he wasn't really doing well financially, as some people have suggested, and that was actually literally the rest of his money that he had and his entire collection of remaining paintings? And what if he was just trying to get all that out there and kind of start fresh? I don't know. I just have this weird picture in my mind of Everett hiding out in the desert while watching the search parties look for him and just feeling so free from it. Again, I mean, he made it abundantly clear that this freedom is what he was chasing. Maybe he was even returning back to his camp at night to feed the donkeys all the way up until his dad finally found them. And then at that point, he was released from what was literally the last responsibility that he had left. I don't know. That's just me speculating, obviously, but I don't know. We don't have anything else, so like, it kind of makes sense, right? Since 1934, several people have actually claimed to have seen Everett Roos. People have said they saw him as a wandering artist in Arizona, a strange drifter all the way down in Mexico, a hiker in the Sierra Nevadas, even a silent elderly white man in a Native American community. But none of these sightings were ever confirmed to be Everett himself. But still, I think this theory I've presented here is, I mean, it's as good as any, right? I mean, to disappear completely and restart as a new person may have been to Everett the ultimate act of freedom, which aligns with his letter about not wanting to return to civilization anytime soon, with his documented stress about the people in his life, including his family, and especially with his final sign-off to the world as no one. And to me, this is why Everett really is the Christopher McCandless that no one really talks about, because just like McCandless, neither of them wanted to be famous. Neither of them was looking to become a legend or a folk hero or even a role model. These two guys just loved nature and both seemed to be running away from society, from family names, and even from some secrets that they were hiding. And in a strange way, Everett achieved exactly what he sought. He vanished into the desert and became timeless. Neither alive nor dead, neither found nor forgotten. Over 90 years later, we're still asking the same question. What happened to Everett Roos? Did he slip into a canyon? Did outlaws silence him? Did he take his own life? Or did he simply vanish on purpose, erasing himself from the world? The desert has kept that secret. But what do you think? Drop your theory in the comments below. And if you found yourself caught up in this mystery, be sure to hit that like button and be sure to subscribe to the channel, especially if you made it all the way to the end of the video like this. I really appreciate you guys. YouTube seems to think that you'll enjoy watching this video next, and so give it a click, and I will see all of you in the next video.